Hey, welcome to our first video on our new book series for John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. If you're interested in following along, this is the copy of the book I've been reading. And moving forward with the quotes I put up, I'm going to put the page numbers of this copy of the book on the screen as well. And if you're getting your own copy and you want to support this channel, I'm going to attach an Amazon link below and just click that one to get this book. All right, let's get started. From the beginning of the chapter, Mill makes it clear that the focus of this book is not so much on liberty of will, meaning what a person can literally do or not do, but rather civil liberty or social liberty. This is defined as the nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. The key words here are really society rather than government, and also legitimately, meaning they're doing so within the boundaries of the law. What exactly these limits of power should be, according to Mill, is the vital question of the future, and has already divided society in some sense. In the earlier parts of history, this struggle primarily took place between subjects, or certain classes of subjects, and the government. In these times, liberty primarily meant protection against the tyranny of political rulers. This makes sense as, apart from Greece, rulers in these times were viewed as a necessary opposition to their subjects. They held their power often to the displeasure of those they ruled over, but it was viewed as necessary to have one power far greater than the rest to prevent the weaker members of society from being preyed upon by vultures or criminals. But ironically, this amount of power meant the rulers themselves could prey on many members of society, not just the most vulnerable.
I am the king!
And so our initial intent of liberty is to restrict that particular power.
I will punish you.
This was obtained in two ways. The first was by gaining recognition of certain immunities, called political rights or liberties, that a ruler could not infringe upon. If a ruler did infringe upon these rights, it would be viewed as a breach of duty on the part of the ruler, and the people would therefore be justified in some sort of resistance or even rebellion. And the ruling powers of most European countries were compelled to submit to this method of obtaining liberty. Things were not so easy with method 2, however. The second method, which occurred later than the first, was the establishment of constitutional checks. In this case, the community, or a body that represented the community, created conditions for some of the most important acts of government. And so this, being a little more difficult to establish, became the primary focus of those who desired more liberty. But as time went on, people began to question why the governing body was made up by people whose interests were unassociated or even contradicted their own. It seemed to make more sense to have the governing power made up by delegates who were removable from power, so that the governing power's interests aligned with the people's. And this would be to ensure that the abuse of power wouldn't even happen in the first place. So this new concept became the new focus of anyone who already succeeded in limiting government power in methods 1 and 2 described earlier. And in particular, this became the main focus of the most powerful parties in the countries, whatever the basis of those parties were. So now people are less focused on the amount of power given to rulers and more focused on how the ruler's interests can be better aligned with the interests of the people. The nation did not need to be protected against its own will. There was no fear of its tyrannizing over itself. Let the rulers be effectually responsible to it, promptly removable by it, and it could afford to trust them with the power of which it could itself dictate the use to be made. And this is not what Mill himself believed, but rather the line of thought that was most popular in Europe at the time that Mill was writing. But as people dreamt and pushed for these ideas of popular government, they neglected to consider whether they needed to limit their power over themselves. After witnessing the French Revolution, Mill notes that many of the ideas of people governing themselves did not manifest in reality, and those who ended up exercising power did not really represent the interests of those underneath them. Quite often, the will of the people ends up translating to the will of the majority or the will of the most active part of the population. The majority, however it is formed, may end up wanting to suppress the minority, and precautions are needed against this, as is needed with any abuse of power. So the lesson here is that limitations on the powers of government is no less important in a system in which the rulers are held accountable as a system where the rulers were not held accountable. And this is because it is the majority, or the most powerful party, that ends up being the ones to regulate the tyranny of government. And during this phenomenon of the tyranny of the majority, the suppression of the minority by the majority not only affects political life, but also bleeds into the social fabric of society. A social tyranny leaves fewer means of escape, penetrating much more deeply into the details of life and enslaving the soul itself. And to maintain it against encroachment is as indispensable to a good condition of human affairs as protection against political despotism. Despotism. While people may agree with this in theory, there are no limits in place or ideas of exactly how to place limits that will create a balance between individual independence and social control. What exactly these limits or rules should be is the principal question of human affairs. No two countries, or two time periods for that matter, have created identical systems. And to each country, their own rules of conduct appear to themselves as self-evident and self-justifying. This all but universal illusion is one of the examples of the magical influences of custom, which is not only, as the proverb says, a second nature, but is continually mistaken for the first. People are usually guided by their feelings rather than reason on what standards of human conduct they believe should be established. They believe people should act as they do, or like those with whom they sympathize would like them to act. For the ordinary man, these feelings serve not only as a perfectly satisfactory justification for their views on human conduct, but also for their views on taste, morality, and even religion. These feelings can be based on social affections, envy or jealousy, arrogance or contemptuousness, but most commonly of all, their fears or desires for themselves, also known as their self-interest. If we view a country in which one class is elevated above the rest, we will find that that elevated class is the one who makes up the ideas of morality and the rules of human conduct for the whole society. When that reigning class is in decline, however, the overall moral sentiments of the country will include an impatient disdain for ideas of superiority. Another determinant of the rules of human conduct include how subservient that society is to the whims of their gods or religions. Sentiments that have little to do with the interests of society have a tendency to become feelings or establishments of morality with great force. So Mill says, as he writes, that England is in an interesting time because while there is a great deal of social influence over the individual, they have not yet captured the powers of government in a way to make that social influence also a legal influence. Or will it? There's already a considerable amount of feeling to push back against the government for any interference with individual liberty regardless of the issue. And Mill says this is likely just as often a misguided suspicion as it is a well-grounded one. This is because there's no reliable principle on which we can judge a government's interference as good or bad. And therefore people will flow to different sides of different issues depending on their personal sentiments. In consequence of this absence of rule or principle, one side is at present as often wrong as the other. The interference of government is, with about equal frequency, improperly invoked and improperly condemned. The goal of this book is to provide a principle on which we can guide society's behavior towards the individual, whether that behavior is conducted through governmental or social means. And that principle is this, that the only time power can rightfully be exerted over the individual, limiting their liberty and against their will, is when it's being done to prevent harm to others. For their own good, whether physical or moral, is not a good enough justification. You can try to reason with them and convince them to do what you believe is in their best interest, but you can't use any means of force rightfully. The individual should be the sovereign to their own mind and their own body. Now, the exercise of rightful liberties that only affect themselves directly. It may still affect others indirectly, and that's going to be considered later in the book. Now, this principle is only meant to refer to people in the maturity of their facilities, which means men and women fully grown and considered adults. Children, or those not considered adults, still need to be protected from themselves.
That's why adults are charged with making those decisions for them and protecting them.
If society has not developed to a point in which free and fair discussion is possible, if chaos or violence will break out, for example, then despotism, essentially the absence of liberty, may be a better option for the time being. In addition to preventing harm from others, we should also consider the positive acts which an individual should be compelled to perform. This includes providing evidence in a court of justice, bearing their fair share in the common defense. This is because while you live in the country at other times, you receive protection over your life by the country and by the service of others. And finally, to perform certain acts of benevolence. For example, protecting a defenseless creature from misuse or danger and mistreatment. Now, foreshadowing the next chapter, freedom of expression and publishing opinion is a tricky topic, as while it does affect others, it is not really separable from the individual, kind of like thought itself. Our appropriate region of human liberty is comprised of three areas. First, our inward domain of consciousness. Liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical or speculative, scientific, moral, or theological. The second is the freedom of tastes and pursuits, the freedom to frame the plan of our own life to fit our own character, of doing as we like, subject to such consequences as may follow, without impediment from our fellow creatures, so long as what we do does not harm them, even though they should think our conduct foolish, perverse, or wrong. And finally, individuals have the freedom to engage in these liberties with one another, so long as they are not harming others and everyone is of full age. Without respecting all of these liberties, a society cannot be free, regardless of its form of government. Alright, that's everything we have for this week. I hope you guys liked it. I'm so excited to be doing this new book, and I'll see you guys next time for chapter 2.